Okay. Now, today's presenter, and if I may ask that the person who still has their camera on to please turn that off. Thank you. Okay. So thank you. So our presenter today is Dr. Maureen Frank, and she has a PhD in wildlife biology from Utah State University. She studied migrating phalaropes and grebes on Great Salt Lake. And if you want to read an interesting story about birds, just read about the phalaropes and grebes, and I hope you get to hear her talk about that sometime. She knows those guys intimately. She did her undergraduate work at Texas A&M, and I guess that's what brought her back to her current role, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. She provides outreach and education about all things wildlife, especially programs that create connections between people and their local natural resources, which is so important as we know today. And today she's going to talk, I love this title, to burn or not to burn, that's still the question, because we know that we've all heard that prescribed burns. I was told once that you don't call it control burns because you can't control a fire, but there are purposely set fires called prescribed burns that are used to manage habitat. And we also often make a lot of assumptions about what a prescribed burn will do, will not do. And as a good scientist, Dr. Frank knows that you have to have the data to back up those assumptions. So what she's going to talk to us today is a study that was done on the Edwards Plateau ecoregion for 3 years, and to determine really what if burning a prairie, so they burned part of it and then they had a control where they didn't burn it. She'll tell you all about it and what they found out from this study. So I'll turn it over to Maureen at this point. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Patsy. Let me share my screen real quick.
Let me stop mine. There we go.
Okay. All right, so as Patsy said, I am going to talk today about to burn or not to burn, and that is still the question. I clarified the subtitle here a little bit to say that we'll be talking about vegetation management for avian species of greatest conservation needs. So we'll talk about what that means. But I guess maybe a little bit of a disclaimer first is that I am not a fire scientist. So we have some fire scientists who work for Extension, and they're fantastic, and they know a lot more about the technical burning side of things. But from my perspective, the point of this study was these areas were already going to be burned, and I wanted to look at how that affected bird response. But of course, that's very much tied to the vegetation response to those fires. So here's kind of an overview of what I'll discuss today. I'm going to give some background on the project, and we'll talk about the birds that we were looking at and what that SGCN means. We'll talk a little bit about burns, and then I'll go through our work and what our goals were, who we worked with, what our surveys looked like, and then some results, which, spoiler alert, aren't actually that exciting, and that's why to burn or not to burn is still the question. But there's a lot that we learned from this, and there's a lot that can be useful to other landowners. And then we'll talk about what we're moving forward, because this work will be continuing in the future as well. So first, let's talk about species of greatest conservation need. This may be a term that y'all have already heard. We abbreviate it SGCN. But basically, these are species that have been designated in all states across the US. And it includes things that are threatened and endangered. So we already think about those when we're thinking about conservation need. But then also species that are declining or rare. So kind of the background on this was that several years ago, more than 10 years ago now, the states were asked to put together these species lists so that we could prioritize conservation, because there's, as much as we want everything to be doing well, we only have so much money and so much time. And so the states were asked what needs to be done first, what needs to be prioritized. Where is that greatest need so that we can put our effort there and hopefully keep those declining and rare species from becoming state or federally listed. We don't want them on that threatened or endangered list if we can do that proactive work on the front side to keep that from happening. And so there's a variety of reasons that these species may be declining or rare, or something, you know, what gets a species listed on this list. Habitat loss is one of the most common, and that can look like a lot of different things. The other thing is sometimes there's just a lack of information. So we are seeing trends that this species is declining or rare, especially with rare species, right? And so then by listing it on this list, we say we need more information, because maybe they're rare because they're not doing well. Maybe they're rare because we don't have as much information as we need. So these various factors were considered by both experts and community scientists. So there was a lot of different input that came in to these lists. Texas, I believe, lists around 1,300 species, and that's because we're not just talking about birds, right? So I kind of put a snapshot of pictures over here, and we're talking about everything from, you know, terrestrial vertebrates, so mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians, to our marine animals, so things such as sea turtles. There's some whales that are listed, marine fish, certainly freshwater fish as well. Invertebrates, so this includes everything from honeybees to freshwater mussels that are of concern, beetles, spiders that live in, you know, particular caves, especially when we're talking about the Edwards Plateau, you know, cave obligate spiders and things like that. And then plants is kind of our last category. So all of those different species are considered on this list. So specifically when we're looking at birds that are SGCN in the Edwards Plateau, so that limits it down a lot, right? So we've got that 1,300-ish species. We're going to only look at the ones of those that are birds, and then only look at the ones of those that are occurring in the Edwards Plateau. That brings us down to about 33 species of birds. Now this is for the entire Edwards Plateau ecoregion. So some of these are not showing up in the area that I was studying. You know, some of them are just kind of on the edge of the ecoregion and into other ecoregions. But of those 33 species, one of those is endangered. So golden-cheeked warblers are still listed as endangered. 3 are threatened, and then 1 candidate, because the Sprague's candidate is federally considered a candidate for listing. And so those, other than that, that leaves us with 28 species that are not currently listed. And the goal, again, is to keep them from ending up on a state or federal list. And so one of the neat things too about this list is that as you go through, there's a lot of information, and you can find this full list, by the way, on the Texas Parks and Wildlife website. It's a great big Excel file. So if you're really interested in digging into the different SGCN all across the state, you can get these data online. But basically they talk about, you know, which ecoregions the species occurs, and why, you know, specifically what their status is. So are they, maybe they're doing really well in most of the US, but not so well in Texas, or vice versa. And then it talks about their, what their habitat looks like. So where do we typically find these? Like what kind of, you know, vegetation are they associated with? And then it talks about what are the threats to this species. So it will list things like, you know, this species has been affected by climate change, habitat loss, species that are impacted, you know, species that we don't know enough about, you know, what's going on, but we know that their populations are declining. And so when you look at that list for these birds in the Edwards Plateau, 19 of those 33, so over half, are affected by the improper use of fire. So in some manner, when you're looking through that list and looking at those different reasons why these species aren't doing well, fire is mentioned in some way for 19 of those. And when we think about the history of fire throughout the United States, this makes sense, because the suppression of fire is a misuse of that tool that was, you know, well, in places today is still being misused. And for a long, long time, you know, we thought there should be no fires, right? Fire destroys, fire is bad. And so especially early in the 1900s, you know, there was widespread suppression of fire. So that's number one, not enough fire affects a lot of these species. Well, why do birds care how much fire is on the landscape? For most of those species, when it talks about not enough fire, it talks about the fact that that leads our vegetation communities to a later successional state. So when we're talking about vegetational succession, we're talking about the progress that the vegetation will go through after a disturbance. So a fire comes through, what are the first plants that come up? There's going to be forbs typically that are going to be, you know, our weeds, right? And especially some that are very adapted to fire, those pop up first. And then later on we get grass and brush and trees and other different kinds of trees, and we get to those later successional stages. Well, if we don't have any fire, we get stuck in that late successional stage, and we don't ever come back to those early stages. Now, some species use that late successional stage. There are some species that need those great big trees and need certain species of trees. But there are other species that really rely on that early vegetation that's happening. And so if we don't have any of that, it's a problem for them. So not enough fire is part of that. Fire at the wrong time. So there's, you know, typically times of year where naturally fire would have occurred. And especially in a lot of different areas, but especially in the Edwards Plateau, the landscape is adapted to this fire occurring at a particular time. Not that fire can't occur at any, you know, particular time of the year, because if we think about how does fire start naturally, well, it starts through lightning storms. But so that can happen whenever, but if you think about when do our big lightning storms typically come here in the Edwards Plateau, there's a pretty set time for that. So as we've returned fire to the landscape, setting a fire at the wrong time can have negative impacts. Now, there's different reasons that you may burn. There's what we call warm season fires or cool season fires. Really, a better term is growing season or non-growing season fires, because there's warm season doesn't necessarily make sense. As Patsy pointed out, it's gorgeous here today. And so even though this would be a cool season fire, it's kind of warm. So making sure that the fires are happening at a time that's beneficial. Now, because of how we've impacted fire on the landscape, sometimes we're going to burn at not the time that a fire would typically have occurred, but sometimes this is just kind of to get us back into that correct interval. This is related to unnaturally intense fires, and actually this relates to not enough fire as well. And this is part of what we've seen, unfortunately, this year out in the western part of the US, is that when an area is not burned, when fire is suppressed for much longer than it should be, when the fire does return, there's such a high fuel load that the fire will be unnaturally intense. So if you think about it, running a fire through, say, every 5 to 7 years, you clear out some of that material and it keeps it from ever building up, you know, a lot of dead grass and brush and all that other material. If you wait and say 15, 20 years until the next fire, you've got a lot of fuel built up. And so when it does come through, it gets much hotter and we can kill certain plants that otherwise would normally survive through a fire. All right, so this is kind of to explain a little bit better what fire in the hill country is supposed to look like. So this is a map from an organization. The website's listed there on the bottom, but basically it shows fire, this map shows fire all across the United States, what the fire regime, what the natural fire interval should be. And I've cropped it down to just Texas plus the legend because that's what we're going to talk about today. What I think is interesting on this map is you can really see where the Edwards Plateau is. And so if you look at it, this map that's adjacent, I think I can write on here. Maybe I can't, but hopefully y'all can see my mouse. And so this picture that's over here on the right, you can see the blue indicates the Edwards Plateau ecoregion. And if you compare that to this map of the fire regime, you can see that kind of burnt orange color is pretty much exactly where the Edwards Plateau is. So in addition to all the things that make the Edwards Plateau ecoregion unique are, you know, karst topography or limestone soils, you know, shallow soils and certain types of vegetation that are adapted to live here and animals that are adapted to live here. Our fire regime is unique from a lot of the rest of Texas. Now, some of this kind of extends like how we see it going up, you know, up to the north here. but you can definitely tell on this map where the Edwards Plateau is located. And that color, when we look at our fire regimes, is supposed to be frequent and low severity. So fire is supposed to occur here fairly often, but when it does occur, it is supposed to be fairly low severity. And so that's important when we think about the effects of fire suppression. So let's talk a little bit, just kind of the last piece of background of bird habitat on private lands and what does that look like. So whenever we're talking about habitat, remember that we're talking about food, water, shelter, and space for a particular species. So, you know, all of this that's being done, all of this research that we've invested in, the point is to be able to help private landowners manage their properties for the benefit of birds. Because the vast majority of Texas, about 95% of the state, is privately owned. So if we want to accomplish conservation, we need to come up with things that are going to be landowner friendly and, you know, things that make sense and are easy for landowners to implement. And so what does that look like in ways that will help our birds? First off, a lot of times restoring native plants. I know there's some master naturalists on this call. Hopefully you got to attend the conference this year and listen to Dr. Talamy's talk about the importance of native plants. It was absolutely incredible. And if you didn't get to hear that talk, kind of the synopsis is that native plants are absolutely crucial for conservation because native plants produce far more insects than non-native plants. And when we think about what our birds are needing from that food component of habitat, they need insects for the most part. There are, you know, as much as we think about birds coming into bird feeders, and seed can be important, especially during colder times of year, we have got to have native plants to produce those insects. There was some research shared that a Carolina chickadee raising its family, so 2 adults and 4 young, require somewhere around 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars in one breeding season for that nest to be successful. And the more caterpillars they have, the earlier the young fledge, and the more successful they'll be. And Carolina chickadees are one of our SGCN for this ecoregion. So when we think about what is happening across our landscapes and the number of invasive plants, non-native invasive plants that we have, it's really important that one of our management actions be to restore native plants. Can fire do that? Yes, there are situations in which fire can help us restore native plants. Again, this is where a little bit more of the fire science comes into play, and I can't necessarily answer all those questions about which plants will benefit more than others. But this is also where you have to consider the time of year that the burn is going to occur. So reducing invasive plants is also something that fire can help us accomplish in some situations. And this along with just kind of reducing the fuel load and the biomass was a lot of the consideration for these places that were being burned in this study. And then just other management actions that are going to be important for private landowners, like providing supplemental water, reconnecting resources. In other words, the more properties that we can get to participate in these sorts of actions, the better the space becomes for our birds, because they don't have just islands of resources. They have connected areas that they can use. And of course, with birds, we always think about, well, they can fly from one area to another. If there's better food over there and better shelter over here, they can get from one place to the other. But the less energy they have to expend trying to get from one place to the other, the better. And also when we think about our other species, you know, something like the lizard, they can't hop one property to another to try to get resources that aren't available. So connecting these resources is going to be something really important just when we think about this land management. All right, so I've talked a little bit about some of the goals of this project, but basically we had 2 different properties that we got to work on, both of which were already planning to burn. And so we set up in advance sites where we were going, sites that we knew would be burned and sites that we knew would not be burned. And on the Shield Ranch, we knew that they do not have any grazing taking place out there. And at the Kerr Wildlife Management Area, they do have grazing taking place. And so that was another thing that we kind of wanted to consider in having those 2 different properties, was not just that we could compare these burned and unburned areas, but that we could also compare areas that were grazed and not grazed across the different properties. And then another major goal, so as Patsy mentioned, most of what I do is outreach to the public. And so we wanted to be able to take these results at the end of the day and outreach it to landowners. And this will happen through field days and publications. And I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end. So our partners in this, all of this work was funded by a grant through the Shield Heirs Foundation, which is connected with the Shield Ranch. And so the Shield Ranch and their staff were very helpful with us for going out and doing bird surveys as well. Their ranch manager is quite a good birder. And so he helped us with a lot of our surveys. The Kerr Wildlife Management Area always gave us access to different places that they were, and they let us use some of their seasonal staff for vegetation work, which was very valuable. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then we do have a couple volunteers who came along regularly, one volunteer in particular who's a birder out here who would help us with those surveys on the Kerr Wildlife Management Area. And so that's because all of our surveys were double observer surveys. So we had 2 people going out at any given time. This was a 3-year study, so from 2018 through this year. And we were going out and recording all species seen and heard. So we set up those burned and unburned locations, and each of those was for a point count. So we would go out for 10 minutes and record everything that we saw and heard from that point. They were randomly placed on those properties within the burned and the unburned areas, but they were spaced far enough apart so that we knew we weren't going to be counting the same birds from one place to another. And we went out and we did this twice per month during the breeding season and once per month during the non-breeding season. So we wanted to document birds that were occurring on these properties really all throughout the year, but especially because most of the SGCN birds that are using this area are here during the breeding season. That was really our focus. So we counted all the different birds that we saw, not just SGCN. And that kind of helps us get an overall idea of what is happening on these properties after fire. But again, we really kind of focused on those SGCN, and most of those were here during the breeding season. All right, so the bird surveys were the fun part. Vegetation was maybe less fun. We went out and did our vegetation work when it was during the non-breeding season, because we were going out so frequently during the breeding season. And as you can see, one of those days in particular was quite cold. So it was only 28 degrees. I had to take a picture of the thermometer in the truck, and I took a picture of myself all bundled up because it doesn't typically get quite that cold here. But what we wanted to do, the plan for this, was to compare the vegetation response 2 years after the burn. So we didn't want to go out right after the burn and you don't have a response right away. You've got to give a little bit of time for that vegetation to come back and see what different things are coming back. Now, we weren't as much concerned with the species of vegetation. Both of these properties have quite a bit of native vegetation, and the main concern with invasive vegetation is cedar, which of course, ash juniper is native, but it's invasive because it will take over, especially in areas where fire has been suppressed. So we were not as much concerned with the species of vegetation we saw as the structure of vegetation. Do we have open areas for these birds that are typically coming into an area that's been burned because it has open areas? What does our brush look like? Did these fires do a good job, even with native brush, of setting that back a little bit so that there's more openings for these birds to use? Especially when we think about things like black-capped vireo that nest in trees of a very specific height, it's important to keep that brush from getting too tall and to have a variety of heights of brush. So those were kind of the things that we wanted to look at. This picture shows some of our tools that we used. The Daubenmire frame is a fancy sounding name for the very simple black and white PVC frame that's over there on the right. And we use that to place at intervals along the ground and look at how much within the frame is grass versus leaf litter versus forbs, that kind of thing. Point-centered quarter has to do with how close the nearest brush is to the center of those points where we're conducting surveys. So it kind of gives you an idea, are you closed in by brush all around, or is there a little bit of space from where you're standing to the nearest brush? And then cone of obstruction, I should say cone of visibility, is an interesting measurement that I had actually not done before we did this project. But the idea is, if you are a ground dwelling bird, like a quail, and you're about 7 to 8 inches tall, what does the landscape look like from your eyes? Is it so dense that you can't even move around? Or does it give you some, is it so open that a predator could see you from miles and miles away? And so it's a way to measure from about 7 inches off the ground, what is going to block the view of something from seeing you. So it was kind of an interesting and fun one to do. I could not find, at some point I took a picture of us doing this vegetation work and having to climb through the brush. So that was the reason it was less fun, was not just because it got cold on one of the days, but also because some of these areas were fairly brushy, and we did quite a bit of brush hugging, which, depending on the type of brush, may not be the most comfortable thing in the world, but I could not find those pictures. All right, so what did we learn? This is the fun part, or the exciting part, is what were our results. The first thing we learned, pretty quick right off the bat, is that fire is tricky. And this is one of the challenges and one of the hesitations for a lot of people with using prescribed fire, is that it can be very tricky to get it right. And Patsy made a great point in saying that there's no such thing as a controlled burn, because once you light that fire, it's not in your control. But you can manage it as best you can. Things can still happen, and you really have to plan it out well in advance to make sure you get the results that you want. So the burn that was conducted at the Shield Ranch was not bad, but it wasn't maybe as successful as we would have liked it to have been. So it didn't get some of the brush kill that we hoped that it would. So that's an important first point, because it meant that we had some of what happened like on the ground level with our grass and our forbs and our leaf litter was different between there and the unburned areas on that same property. But some of the bigger vegetation, like some of the agarita that we really wanted to kill, didn't die from the fire. And so some of those things, there was not as much of a difference as we had thought there might be between the burned and the unburned areas. At Kerr Wildlife Management Area, on their times that they were hoping to burn, stuff happened. And this is part of managing a fire well, right? Is you don't want to burn if it's too windy, or if the humidity's too high or too low or too hot or too cold. All those, it's kind of Goldilocks conditions to get a fire to work out just right. So we had hoped to have fire at the beginning of 2018 and then conduct all of our studies comparing burned and unburned areas. They weren't able to burn in 2018. So what we ended up with was 2018 data at Kerr WMA was all pre-burn data, which was kind of nice because we got to survey all of those points, what they looked like before the burn. But then, because of when everything was scheduled to be burned, everything got burned in 2019, which again was just the way that it needed to go. That was the way that it worked out for their purposes. And so we ended up with all pre-burn and post-burn instead of being able to compare burned and unburned within the same year. And so that limits our ability to interpret the results a little bit, because we don't know if the differences that we saw from 2018 to 2019 have to do with the fact that it was different years, with unburned to burned, or if it has to do with first it was unburned and then it was burned. So fire is very tricky to use. And this isn't to discourage people from using it. It's just, it's kind of something to be aware of for our landowners, is that it's something that you want to work on with a lot of other people, and you want to work with people who have been doing this, for a long time. The burn, once they did burn at the Kerr, it was very successful. It kind of looked like what they hoped that it would look like, and they've been burning out there for a very long time. There's definitely kind of a set burn schedule that, as long as the weather cooperates, they get to follow. But always look to professional advice when considering conducting a burn. All right, the next lesson we learned was that properties in the Edwards Plateau can support many, many bird species, including a lot of species of greatest conservation need. So at the Shield Ranch and Kerr, we really saw a very similar number of total species. We counted a total of 80 different species on the Shield, 81 on the Kerr. While those properties are similar, there are some differences between those. So there were some species that didn't overlap. So you can see our total was 95 unique species counted across those properties. And our SGCN were really similar across the properties as well. So 14 different species at Shield, 15 at Kerr, and then a total of 16 unique species across the both places. What's really neat about this, so Kerr Wildlife Management Area, I haven't addressed this yet. Of course, that's actually a public property, right? That's a state-owned property, which is different from the Shield Ranch, which is privately owned. But again, with the vast majority of our state being privately owned, it's so crucial that we do conservation work and help our landowners to do conservation work on those properties. So I think it's kind of neat to show in this example, Shield Ranch is smaller than the Kerr. It's a little bit less, I don't want to say it's less diverse, it just has different, some different landscape features, but our total number of species in SGCN were almost identical. This is something that's kind of increasingly being realized across the country too. There's actually an article that came out either in Science or Nature, one of those two big journals that came out this year about the importance of private lands for conservation. So sometimes we think about, oh, it's important to have Yellowstone National Park and, wilderness areas and state parks. And while those are really important, the conclusion of that study was that we will not accomplish conservation unless we work with private land partners. And so I think this illustrates, just in comparing those number of species, are a well-managed private property can be just as valuable as a well-managed public property. And that landowner investment is so important. All right, and then the last thing we learned was that burning didn't have the impact we expected. Now remember, there could be a number of reasons for this, right? So the first thing was that we didn't have quite the burn didn't look like what we thought it should at the Shield. We burned everything all in 1 year at the Kerr, so it's kind of important to keep those in mind. But overall, before we talk about this chart, overall there was no difference in the number of species detected in the burned versus the unburned areas on each property, and there was no difference in the number of species of greatest conservation need detected from the burned to the unburned. So if our goal was to say, hey, we're going to burn it and there will be more SGCN using those areas, that didn't happen. Or maybe we're wrong, maybe burning is bad, and maybe those unburned areas will keep more SGCN. We didn't see that either. They were about the same numbers on both. Now, as we look at this table a little bit, when we look at the individual species, and all of these ones that I've listed here are some of the species of greatest conservation need. I didn't want to list them all out, but there were some opposite trends that we saw. So if we look at these, we'll start with the red-shouldered hawk up top. We detected a total of 7 of those burned areas on Shield, 7 of those in the unburned areas, 5 of those in the burned, and only 1 in the unburned at Kerr. Those numbers are not big enough or significant enough or different enough to tell us that we really saw something different in the burned versus unburned areas. So, okay, probably the same. Bell's vireo, I find it kind of amusing that we had 0 in the burned at Shield, 4 in the unburned, and 4 in the burned at Kerr, and 0 in the unburned at Kerr. But again, because that detection was so small, we can't really say if that's truly a difference or if it just has to do with the number that we were actually able to detect. Now, black-capped vireos, on the other hand, we actually see a little bit of a trend here. And on across these 2 properties, that trend matches. So we detected about twice as many black-capped vireos in the burned areas of Shield, and we detected almost 10 times, I guess it's probably about 9 times as many black-capped vireos in the burned areas of Kerr. Y'all, if you haven't seen a black-capped vireo yet, if that's still on your bucket list, go to the Kerr Wildlife Management Area. They often have some nesting just right outside their office. There are lots of them out there. And this is obviously a species, when the SGCN list was created, they were federally listed as endangered. They've since been removed from that. And Kerr is contributing. They are doing their part to producing a lot of black-capped vireos. So in that situation, we might say, hey, future research could look at how this impacts, that burned areas may be better for black-capped vireos. And in fact, there's already been some research done that says, yeah, that can probably make a difference for that species. Now, remember, for our study, we were looking at SGCN as a whole, which is why I say there was not a lot of difference. But for some species like black-capped vireo, we could kind of see that difference. Yellow-throated warblers were just not found very often on the Kerr, but so on the Shield Ranch, we found twice as many of those in the unburned areas compared to the burned areas. Golden-cheeked warblers, again, we did not find a whole lot in either location. Summer tanager on the Shield Ranch, we saw almost no difference between unburned and burned areas. Very similar across the two, whereas in Kerr, we had about 8 times as many in the burned areas versus the unburned areas. Now, this is where it's important to remember how these data were collected. And at the Kerr, we had first everything was unburned and then everything was burned. So it may be that there was actually a bigger impact of the year and when those things were burned compared to actually seeing a difference in how summer tanagers use burned versus unburned areas. So that's kind of something, you know, to consider there. Shield Ranch, again, there may just not have been as much of a difference because that burn didn't make as big of a difference in some of those things that summer tanagers might be needing. And then field sparrows, this is an interesting one where we have very opposite trends. At the Shield Ranch, we had about, not quite 3 times, about twice as many field sparrows detected in the unburned points. And then at the Kerr Ranch, we had about 4 times as many detected in the burn points. So those go very opposite of one another as to how that species seemed to be responding. But again, we weren't able to compare quite as much as we might have hoped. So I think one of the messages here, so one of the messages here is that when we're talking about managing for birds on a property, it is challenging to manage for multiple species. So going back to this chart real quick. If you say, I want to increase the number of black-capped vireos on my property, and I think that, I've read that they do well after a prescribed burn, they use some of those areas after a prescribed burn, I think then you can see that in these data as well, that on both properties, there were more black-capped vireos using an area after a burn had been conducted. And we know that from some of the previous research as well. So black-capped vireos, you've got a plan. If you say, well, I want to manage for summer tanagers, on these 2 properties, we're not really sure. Shield Ranch, it may not make that much of a difference if you burn or not. Kerr, it looks like the burn made a lot of difference, but maybe that is kind of complicated by the fact that our burns, we weren't comparing burned and unburned areas in the same year. So we kind of need more information on that one. And then it's possible that some things are doing better in the unburned areas. So again, at the Shield Ranch, yellow-throated warblers, we had about twice as many in the unburned areas. So maybe they need some of that unburned habitat. So depending on what you're managing for is really going to affect your decisions as to which tools that you end up using. And I think sometimes it's hard because we think about, well, I want to help everything, right? I want to return this to being as natural as possible. And so this is where when we're managing for multiple species and managing for multiple purposes, it's important that we have both on a property. So the Shield Ranch and Kerr are both fairly large areas. And so that's why they're not burning, very few places would you advise to burn the whole property all at once, because then you're just going to have the same resources available across this whole area. But if you burn part of it, and leave the other part, and then you say if you want a 5-year rotation and you break that property up into 5 different pieces and burn this year and then burn this one the next year and kind of move through, thinking of it like rotational grazing, but kind of like a rotational fire, then you keep that patchwork of different things happening in different places. You end up with a fire that produces a lot more vegetation diversity. I think the other thing here, though, is that when we think about overall bird diversity, which again was part of the point of this study, is what do the overall SGCN look like across these different areas? There's a lot of reasons that somebody might want to burn. So burning, for example, can increase the nutritional quality of forage for cattle. So if you're thinking, I would think I should conduct a prescribed burn to benefit my cattle, the overall bird diversity was not negatively impacted by burning at either of these sites. So there may be reasons other than birds that you want to burn, and it looks like that is okay to do. So that's important to know just as we consider this tool. Some species are impacted more than others, so I kind of broke that down and thinking about the goals and priorities. And this is something that I work with landowners a lot. And I don't know if anybody listening in today is a landowner or not, but definitely something to be aware of is what are your goals and priorities? If you know already that there are black-cap vireos on your place, and that's something that you can benefit by conducting a prescribed burn, then I think that's something that you can burn, and you can know that you're managing for that species. If maybe you've never seen a yellow-throated warbler on that property, then you don't want to not burn for the sake of yellow-throated warblers when they're not there right now, and you know that you have black-cap vireos. So getting to know those different species, getting to understand what you already have there, and then figuring out what is going to be the best use of those limited resources. The other point here, though, that I can talk about a little bit more with the Shield Ranch is that maybe we need more fire. And so what I hadn't said is that the Shield Ranch, it had been a while since a burn had taken place. So this is kind of an area where fire hadn't been used very often. And so afterwards, when some fire scientists came in, I got to go out in the field with some of these people and look at what had been done and what should be done in the future. They said, well, you may not have seen a lot of difference because you need to burn it again. And so sometimes, I mentioned that if an area isn't burned, you can end up with a fire that's too intense, and that can be really bad. But if a fire hasn't happened on an area for a long time and you do a nice, controlled, cool season burn, that can be a good start. But you might not see any difference. And that's so hard for landowners or any of us, right? When you do something and you put the effort in and then you're like, nothing happened. It looks the same as it did before. And it may just be that you need to do it again and maybe even a third time, and then you'll start to see those impacts. And so that is another reason that we may not have seen some of the overall species benefit that we thought we would from the burned to unburned areas and really saw the same number of species, is that the fire that had been returned wasn't making as much of a difference. Now, again, the cur has been burned fairly regularly, and most of those areas have been burned on a more regular interval, but we can't really compare with the 1 year versus the other because we didn't have burned and unburned areas in the same year. All right, so next steps, where do we go from here? So even with these results that we found, there's obviously some lessons here, right? There's some things that we learned. There's some stories to tell, even though they're not the stories that we thought they would be. So this coming summer, we will have field days. We're hoping these can be in-person field days because I have a master's student that this is going to be part of her project, is how do we outreach this information in a way that's going to be most useful to landowners. So I appreciate everybody who's on the Zoom call today, but I'm also sure that y'all have attended way more Zoom lessons this year than you ever have, probably like in all the previous years of your life, because I know that's how it's been for me. And so I think people are ready to get out and do some hands-on things, and we want to say, how can we make this the most impactful to landowners as possible? One of those things that we're going to try to do is with a method called peer-to-peer 360 degrees, and this was developed by an extension specialist, a forestry extension specialist up in the Northeast, and we're going to look at kind of using some of his techniques in helping teach this to landowners. It will have a very much prescribed fire focus for the benefit of birds, but also other wildlife and livestock as well. I've also applied for an Ecolab grant for 2021 that we're looking to do some passive acoustic recording. One of the things that's tricky, is as far as counting these species is what are we possibly missing, right? And we know from previous studies that having recorders out there to record bird songs will get you better data than having two people out there listening, even though we try to do our best and hear everything that we can. It would be really neat, especially on different properties, to know that they're recording on the same day, right? Because for us with two different properties, we had to do one day and one another. So you always wonder about little things like weather and those sorts of differences that may affect from one to the other. The other thing is, this is an Audubon Society meeting, so all of y'all are birders, and you know how to go out and identify birds. But for your everyday landowner, they may or may not know how to do that. And there's developing technology when it comes to like automatic song recognition that we think it would be great if a landowner could set out these devices, however many they need, depending on the size of their property, and then be able to put those data into a software that can tell them, these are the species that are on your property, and it helps them manage those species without feeling overwhelmed by having to learn all the birds. Now, I also encourage people to learn their birds. And I always encourage people to, join your Audubon Society or talk to people in your Audubon Society so that you can learn about those different species so that you can recognize them yourself. But depending on what that landowner is doing and how busy he or she is doing other things, that's not always realistic. And so our main goal here is to get this conservation happening on the ground, on these private lands. And so we want to make that as landowner friendly as possible. All right, so we went through a lot just now. I appreciate y'all for kind of listening to what's a pretty sciencey talk and a lot of different details. But the first thing that I've talked about a bunch is that private land management for songbirds is essential for conservation for all of these SGCN, especially in Texas where we have so much private lands. That's going to be really important, and I encourage people to support their private landowners as much as they can. Recovering resources and functioning to the land can take time and repeated efforts. So the Shield Ranch is a fantastic property. If somebody said, you can have this, I would absolutely take it in a heartbeat. There's no way I could buy it, but I would absolutely love to have that property for myself. It's beautiful and it's well managed. They're just trying to make it even better. And so restoring something like fire, it can be a little discouraging, I think, to a landowner when you do this effort and it looks the same as it did before the effort. And so sometimes you have to do it again and again, and remember that something like fire that was happening naturally on kind of a certain cycle, that's something that you'll have to continue to do on a certain cycle. And so that repeated effort is going to be important, and we encourage our landowners to keep up with that. And then finally, measuring the impacts of management actions is going to be really important so that you can adapt your management and know what things maybe need to be changed. If you don't measure and you just assume that burning helps certain species, you may not find out the full story. Or we could say, okay, we made these measurements, or we burned these areas, and we know it doesn't look quite like we thought it would, but I'm just going to assume that the birds are still benefiting, and you can't make those assumptions. The other thing I will mention here, because I talked about the vegetation surveys we did, and then I didn't talk about those measurements, is that we're still analyzing those vegetation data to look at just how different the vegetation looked from before and after burns. Again, with kind of some of the same caveats as our bird counts. I figured birders would be more interested anyhow if I focused more on the birds than on the vegetation and the brush busting that we did. So finally, I'll look through the chat. I've seen a couple of questions pop up. The yellow-breasted chat is kind of appropriate for taking questions from the chat. It was also kind of our nemesis on both of these properties because there are lots of them out there. They are not in the SGCN, but if they were, I would say they didn't need to be because they are everywhere and they certainly make themselves known. And so if I don't get to your question today, or if you think of something later, my email is on here as well. And then the different websites, well, a website and 2 social media. So if you're interested in some of the other bird programs that I do, that's wildlife.tamu.edu/birding. And then we have a Facebook and an Instagram. And actually, before I flip to the questions, seeing Patsy just reminded me that she had asked if I wanted to talk about birding the border. And just as a point of interest for a group of birders, one of the outreach things that we do, and in supporting our private landowners, is hold a we don't really like to call it a festival just because we think of ourselves as more friendly than a festival. And I don't mean that in a bad way to festivals. I just mean to say that we like to get to know our people, and we like it to be an experience where you feel very connected. We're a little bit smaller and more intimate than like a big festival that you would think of. But the main point of Birding the Border is to connect our birders with private landowners and to get onto places that you wouldn't normally get to bird. So this is, I just realized I'm not sharing this yet. So this is our website. If you go to wildlife.tamu.edu/birding, you can then click on Birding the Border and it will bring you here. We have our countdown running because we're super excited. We are planning to host in person in 2021, and we have worked on capping our groups at certain sizes and figured out how we're going to do transportation. And we think we have all the logistics lined out so that at the very least you will be able to bird in person. We don't know what some of our seminars and socials might look like, And of course, a lot can change in the next few months, but we are confident that we can do our birding trips in person. So from this site, you can find out everything you might want to know. There's a place to register, our agenda, and most interesting possibly is our tour locations. So again, in this effort to support private landowners, we have a variety of private lands that are available. Our beginner track is full. So if you know any beginners, that one's actually already full. Our photography track still has some room in it. But you can scroll through and see these pictures of these different places and find out more about them. Some of them, I was actually telling Patsy just before we got started, the Zuberbuehler Ranch is one that has, other than by our staff, has not been birded. And so there's a lot of fun surprises out there to find, I think. The McKenna Ranch, again, we've had a couple events out there. But not in the spring other than our staff going out there. So I think there's a lot of surprises hiding out there as well. And then behind the scenes at the duck pond, if y'all have been to Del Rio and seen the duck pond that you can pull over and look through the fence, this takes us back to, there's about 200 acres behind that fence that you can check out. And there's definitely cool things that are hiding back there. There's fun surprises for sure. All of those are private properties that you can't get on unless you come to Birding the Border. So check that out and I can answer questions about that as well. So I'm going to flip real quick back to my slide and look at the questions that I've got. Okay, so first question, what does frequent mean on the fire map? Every year, every few years? What does low intensity mean? And were trees not killed or seriously damaged? So those are all really good questions. And the frequency in part is going to depend on where in the country that you're living. In Texas, a frequent fire is probably going to be less than, like, more often than every 5 years. And infrequent is going to be more like along the 10-year return interval. Whereas when we talk about out west, you know, some of those, an infrequent fire is once every several decades. So for Texas, yeah, frequent is usually meaning, and that's actually something that I couldn't resolve very well from that map is, you know, they're trying to do the whole entire US with kind of the same scale. But definitely for somewhere like Texas, frequent fire is going to be every 4 to 5 years. There are not many places here that would typically have fire every year. And then, yeah, low intensity is, in part has to do with like how hot that fire is going to burn and whether trees are going to be killed or seriously damaged. So one of the things, and actually one of the things that I've heard kind of proposed for the issues with oak wilt here on the Edwards Plateau is that you used to have fire coming through and clearing out some of those lower branches. So it was low intensity, but a high enough intensity to kill. A low intensity fire should still eat up the dead stuff, right? So if you've got dead branches low on a tree, if you've got dead vegetation all the ground, all of that should be impacted by the fire. A high intensity fire will be able to kill sometimes trees, but definitely brush. You know, cedar should be impacted. There was a fantastic burn that was conducted this year out on the Sonora Experiment Station in West Texas, and they were able to kill mesquite. Like it burned into the ground and killed their roots of the mesquite because it was so high intensity. They did that on purpose. But you know, the higher intensity is going to kill those trees and those brush or damage the trees in some instances. For the most part, again, with Edwards Plateau supposed to have kind of that lower intensity, your oaks should be fine. Your goal is not to kill your oaks, maybe to clean them up a little bit, but it should not be to kill your oaks. And the next question, do natural fires burn a large area, or is it patchy so that is a mixture of burned and unburned area and resources in a given year? Yes, so natural fires typically are going to be burning in a fairly patchy sense. And if we think about this, if we have kind of a regular fire return interval where we're not building up such a big fuel load, the fire should hit an area and then kind of get to a point where it burns itself out. This can vary a lot, and this would be a better question for a fire scientist. But again, this idea that you burn a little bit, maybe the next year. When we talk about a 5-year, 5 to 10 year fire return, we're not talking about burn the whole thing every 5 years. We're talking about burning those different little parts, over a few years. And then how does fire interact with other management practices, manual removal or use, grazing species, and deer management? That's a really good question. is fire definitely interacts with those other management practices, and a lot of it is going to depend on where you are. So something I should probably talk about a little bit more is, I mentioned that fire can be used to reduce invasive species. And if your problem on your property is that you have too much cedar, fire is a good way to deal with that because it is very effective in reducing some of that cedar. If your problem is King Ranch bluestem, like we have here on our property, it is not necessarily going to help, and it actually may hurt. So some of our invasive plants respond really well to fire. So this is part of the importance of knowing what you have beforehand, and your best resource for that is going to be your local Texas Parks and Wildlife biologist, because they can come out and they can do a site visit and they can look at the different plants that you have and say, yeah, you know, fire could really benefit this area, or no, you've got some invasives and we need to be really careful how we manage those. Some of the research that's being done on some of our worst invasives like KR bluestem is we're trying to combine, okay, how do we do like a 1-2 punch or a 1-2-3 punch of using herbicides and fire and manual removal? Is there some sort of recipe that we can actually get rid of these stinking plants that we can't otherwise get rid of? Grazing is definitely something that can benefit from fire. So again, getting kind of that newer vegetation in there can increase the nutritional quality of that forage. And then, yeah, deer can benefit from fire as well. It kind of just depends on, you know, it depends on what everything already looks like, but getting that fresh flush of forbs in the spring, those weedy vegetation, is one of the most nutritious things for deer. The protein contents can be very high in forbs, and those are going to be stimulated after a disturbance, whether that's fire or whether that's disking or some other sort of like manual disturbance of the soil, can be really beneficial to deer. And then asking about not burned since the ranch was purchased 25 years ago and needing more information. Nesting acclimato, that is awesome. And so contact for South Texas, again, I would find your local wildlife biologist, because he or she can actually come to your property and look and say, yeah, this would be a fantastic place to burn, or we need to do some work on these invasives first because we don't want to spread them. They can look at specific wildlife that you have. And so if you are wondering who is your local wildlife biologist, let me flip back to my web browser real quick. I have mine bookmarked as find a wildlife biologist, but if you go to, you know, if you use a search engine and type in TPWD, find a wildlife biologist, you will get this map that shows wildlife biologists all across the state. And so then all you do, I don't know where exactly you are in South Texas, Mary Jo, but you click on the region that looks like it'll have your county, and then you can click on your county. And it will give you all the information for your wildlife biologist and urban biologist if you need one of those. But really, this wildlife biologist is going to be your first contact for coming out to your property and helping you evaluate that. Depending on what species you have, Mary Jo, I know you had asked me earlier about, you have horned lizards, which is awesome. That's something that's managed by your wildlife diversity biologist, so they're another person to contact. But contact your wildlife biologist first, and then he or she can always put you in touch with other biologists in the region that might be helpful. So, so that may be a helpful resource as well. So that's all the questions I've got in the chat right now. So I will turn it back over to Patsy.
Wow, I tell you what, I wish I had had professors who unscience things as well as that. Interpreting the results of that study, it was fascinating. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I was riveted. I just had a couple of questions myself. You mentioned 3 threatened species and 1 candidate. Do you know offhand what those are? Could you name those for the audience?
Yes, the candidate is the Sprague's pipit, and that's a federal candidate species.
Okay.
And then the threatened species, I'm going to pull this up real quick so that I get them right. I believe one of them is the common black hawk. And I don't remember the other 2, but let me find my list.
Well, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I thought
that's okay.
It would be nice to know that.
No, it's the common black hawk, zone-tailed hawk, and tropical parula, which zone-tailed hawk is one that we did have show up at the Kerr Wildlife Management Area a couple times. Black hawk, of course, being a little bit more associated with riparian areas, and we didn't we're kind of out of the range of those, and then tropical parulas, same. But yeah, so those are the three: common black hawk, zone-tailed hawk, and tropical parulas. Again, if you pull this list right now from Texas Parks and Wildlife, it still shows black-hat vireos listed as endangered, even though they've been delisted. So.
Right. Well, I just wanted to, and I know you're probably, I want to put in a real good plug for that Birding the Border. I think, well, I'm going to go on and see what we can, how we can get out on some of that beautiful land. I also want to give a shameless plug. This is Rufus Stevens and Jan Reed's book, Attracting Birds in the Texas Hill Country, A Guide to Land Stewardship. And they just informed me, I was privileged to work on this book as their bibliography maven. That's what they call me, to look up all their sources. And they just found out that the book is sold very well. That's good. People, it means private landowners are listening and trying to help their birds. And this is especially for birds, of course, but they are going to be into their second printing. So this is good news. It's a wonderful book, and it kind of takes by habitat, whatever habitats you have on your ranch or your land. Maybe you don't have riparian, but maybe you have lots. So that makes a big difference. So anyway, it's a wonderful book, and it's available through Amazon, and they also have it at Cibolo Nature Center in the gift shop if you can ever get over there when it's open right now. But it is, the name of the book is Attracting Birds in the Texas Hill Country. Somebody just asked. And it's by Rufus Stevens and Jan Reed, W-R-E-D-E. Rufus Stevens is retired from Texas Parks and Wildlife, and he was one of the originators of the Master Naturalist program. And we work with him at Cibolo on surveys and so forth. So it's wonderful. And if you get a chance to get out and help someone with these surveys as a birder, you learn so much about the relationships between habitat and different species, and it's just a wonderful experience as a birder. You get a depth of knowledge you can't get anywhere else. And I'm sure Maureen and other people like her would welcome your help, your volunteer help for those things. And if you're a plant person, they have to do vegetation surveys and would welcome your help, because those things are, of course, intimately related. Well, this has been a wonderful morning. I want to thank you so much, Maureen, for bringing this to us. And I did want to reiterate, the recording will be posted in a day or so on the Bear Audubon website. So if there's things you want to watch again, or pieces of the slide set or whatever, and all the chat questions and so forth will also be posted. And Maureen, if you want to, I can also put the website to the Birding the Border Festival in there. Okay, well, there'll be a little link that I'll send you to our Dropbox, and it'll have all those things on there that you can do. And also it'll be on our website. So thank you so much. And anybody else have any other questions before we sign off and go enjoy some of this beautiful weather right now that we're having?
Yeah, thank you guys so much. And everybody I hope you enjoy your holidays and enjoy this really nice weather. Hopefully there's lots of birds wherever you are.
Yeah, and bird lots, stay safe. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yay!